Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 318 of the Psych Files, now heading into our 13th year. Wow. So thank you for being a listener and for keeping the show going. And I think we have an interesting episode today. This is an interview with Jeremiah Sullins. He is a professor at Harding University, and he runs their Center for Cognitive Studies. So let's dive in. I am talking on Skype with Dr. Jeremiah Sullins and his research on academic shame. As I understand in your latest research, you're looking at shame. Are you looking at people who are particularly likely to be really frustrated by what we might think of as productive confusion?
For a long time, I was interested in productive confusion, and I have over the last couple of years transitioned into what I call and what some others call academic shame, which I think is an important distinction because there actually is quite a bit of research out there on shame in general, but it's probably more for the clinical people where you're looking at body shaming and abuse like physical and sexual abuse and that, but there hasn't been hardly any research on academic shame, and what I mean by that is shame that occurs in the context of learning and education. When you talk about shame, what you're really talking about is a sense of inadequacy that you feel. I mean, if you wanted a formal definition, shame is a perception of failure that's relative to your own internal rules, ideals, goals, and standards. So at its core, shame is associated with perceptions of failure. So you can have a student that gets a B+ on an exam and they still perceive that to be a failure, and therefore they can experience a moment of shame.
Yeah, you know what first jumped into my mind when I started reading your paper was my son, who's almost 20, but when he was about 8, through those years, he would get his homework and we would do his homework at night, and he'd get stuck on something, and he would just get so emotionally upset. And I would say, hey, look, that process didn't work. Let's try something else. I would try to reframe it as a puzzle, but it never worked. He just got emotionally upset. I think he did feel, like you just said, that it reflected, the fact that he couldn't figure it out reflected really negatively on him.
Yeah, and that's why I think this is so important is there's a huge gap in the literature regarding, we have not yet recognized in modern pedagogy the impact that academic shame has on learning. And so this scenario that you're describing, I feel is a maladaptive feedback cycle that can be brought on. Let me use math, for example. A lot of people just assume they're not math people. Maybe they go into a math class or a math test with anxiety about their performance in the class or on the test. And of course, that anxiety is going to distract your attention. And then, of course, that's going to impair your performance, which, of course, that's going to in turn increase your anxiety. And so you've got this very maladaptive feedback cycle that can occur because the fact is no one's going to gravitate towards a task that leaves them feeling inadequate, especially if there's no resolution in sight.
Right. Your focus is on academic shame. How do you know if someone's experiencing shame?
This is the challenge. So let me preface this by saying the reason that I'm interested in academic shame is a number of different reasons. I mean, number one is because there is a huge gap in the literature. I mean, I don't believe that by itself is a reason to do something. Just because something hasn't been done doesn't mean it needs to be done. But more importantly, the reason that I'm interested in academic shame is of the limited research that has been done, it shows that it causes children to have extreme difficulty in learning in challenging environments. And when you look at populations of college students, when they have a perceived failure and they experience shame, they feel like they couldn't do more than they've already done. Their ability to become engaged with the material becomes hindered. When they look down the road at the final exam, they have a sense of resignation and a lack of motivation for studying, and they really start to view going to class as being a burden or an obligation. And so there's a lot of negative consequences associated with shame. But to get back to your question, the way that I try to measure shame and shame proneness is through a couple of pre-existing questionnaires. Number one is called the TSCA, which stands for the Test of Self-Conscious Affect. This is a valid and reliable measure of who is guilt-prone versus shame-prone. And another popular questionnaire, the ESS, which stands for the Experiential Shame Scale, whereas the TSCA is whether or not you have a proneness to experiencing guilt or shame, the ESS is more of a in-the-moment measure of shame. So at this moment, are you experiencing shame, not whether or not you have a proneness to experiencing shame.
Okay, and so to make sure we're clear, the difference between guilt and shame.
That is a pet peeve of mine, actually, because people use guilt and shame interchangeably all the time. There is a lot of research, not in the academic sense, mind you, but there is a lot of research out there showing distinct differences between guilt and shame. But if I had to boil it down, guilt is brought on by feeling bad about a particular action that you've engaged in, whereas shame, you feel particularly bad as a person. So if I broke a window, I might feel guilty because I broke a window, but if I feel shameful, I'm looking at it as though I broke the window because I'm a bad person.
Okay.
Yeah.
So guilt, so I break the window and I go, oh crap, man, I was what an idiot, I might say. I guess I better go pay for that. Jeez. But to be shameful about it is to go another step and say, man, I'm such an a-hole or whatever, to really start attacking yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, when you feel guilty, you basically want to face the music, so to speak. You're willing to accept responsibility for what happened, and people who feel guilty are likely to seek out resolution for that guilt. But people who feel shameful, those are the ones who tend to run away and self-isolate and just feel bad about who they are as a person.
And so those are the ones academically who are probably going to withdraw, maybe not attend classes as much. How it shows itself in an academic environment.
Yeah, as I was saying, intuitively, of the limited research that's out there, it suggests that shame is not good for learning.
Yeah, and if I was on a institutional review board, you said you wanted to make some students feel ashamed of themselves. I would start to go, okay, hold on there, guy. What exactly are you going to do? How do you induce, without serious threat to the subject, a feeling of shame? How did you attack that in your?
Great question, because that was probably my number one concern when I was coming up with the methodology of this study is I thought, how am I going to get this through the IRB? Which I did. I'm going to go ahead and put that out there. This did get IRB approval. But my thinking was, and I'll describe the specific methodology here in a second, but my thinking is the more I kind of was getting into the design of the study and thinking about the manipulations, it occurred to me that what we're doing or what we did in the lab is no worse than what occurs naturally in a classroom. We just did it in a sterile kind of controlled environment. But what we did, in essence, was we would bring people into the lab and we would have them take a test that consisted of a subset of practice ACT problems. It's the test that you take to get into college, basically. Yeah, and so we would have them take a subset of practice ACT problems. These are all college students, so they've taken the ACT, and so they would get to the end of the test, and we would ask them, first off, how do you feel you did on the test? And we would have them on a scale of 0 to 100, type in what they felt that their score was, and then they would click submit. And what we did was we provided them a false score. So it basically, the screen popped up and said, okay, you scored a 40% on this test, and the average student up to this point has scored a 90% on the test.
False feedback. Then. Now, why did you have them commit to how they think they did prior to receiving this feedback? Why was that important?
Exactly. So the reason that was so important is a number of different reasons. Number one, research has shown that that feeling a sense of shock, kind of shock and surprise, that is significantly positively correlated with feelings of shame. And so in order to determine whether or not these participants even had the possibility of being shocked about this false score, I felt that we needed to get an understanding or a metric of how they did. Because if they felt that they scored a 47 and we told them they scored a 40, you wouldn't expect someone to feel bad about that. But if they felt that they scored an 85 and you told them they scored a 40, that sets up a scenario of shock and surprise.
Right. So it doesn't guarantee that I feel shameful, but it adds to the potential that the experience is shameful.
Yes, exactly. And so what we found in that study a couple of years ago, because what you're hitting the nail on the head in that, our initial research question was, can you systematically induce shame and can you measure it reliably? That was really the first step in this research program that I was attempting to develop. And from that initial study, the answer was a tentative yes, because we did find in a particular subset of students that manipulation that I just described was a highly effective methodology for inducing shame. And more specifically, what we found is that people who had an expectation of success, so they felt like they did well on the exam, and then they have a perception of failure, they're told that they failed the test, coupled with those who were high in shame proneness. So those who have a tendency to experience shame, that's really the trifecta of students who are most likely to experience shame. They feel like they did well, they experience a perception of failure, and they have a high proneness to shame. Not surprisingly, those are the ones that did experience really high shame scores.
Okay, and did that affect their performance on the test?
So in that particular study, we weren't interested at that point seeing how that impacted learning. The only thing we were doing with that particular study was whether or not you could systematically induce it and measure it reliably. But yeah, so the bigger question, and arguably the more important question, was whether or not shame is beneficial or detrimental to learning. I don't want to go off in too much of anecdotal evidence, but just to give you a little bit of my background, which I don't mind sharing with you and your listeners, is I was not a particularly good high school student. I really wasn't even a great college student when I first started, just because I had no direction and I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and I was distracted by other things other than academics. But my point of this is that I remember, I would be sitting in class and the instructor would pass back a test, and I would get my test back and I would immediately see that I just did terribly. And so everybody around me, how it usually works in high school is everybody's looking around to see what everybody else scored, trying to make them feel better about their score by hoping they scored better than their neighbor and all of this. But I would get my test back and see that I did horribly, and I would very quickly flip the test over and I would just slide it under a notebook or something, because I didn't want other people asking me about it. I didn't want other people seeing my test score. And so I don't know, I can't think back exactly to say, well, I was feeling shameful. I mean, maybe I was feeling guilty, or maybe I was feeling embarrassed. But the point is that had a lingering effect that I can still remember, 25 years later. The reason that I started getting into this research is I was curious as to what impact does that have on any subsequent learning that's attempting to occur. So if you get that test back and you slide it under your notebook, and then the teacher immediately jumps into a new lecture, are you even able to process that information in the presence of shame?
Yeah. As instructors, you have a class, and there are some students have clearly done well in high school, and they're just well above others. And so let's say they write a paper and they submit it to me, and some of them are just easy A's, and it's just written really, really well. Some of them, sometimes it happens that I get a paper that just simply cannot compare in any objective way to that really, really good grade. So as a professor, you're sitting there saying, well, I don't really want to give the person an F. I mean, because I know it'll I don't know what effect that'll have. I think sometimes it's really good to give students low grades when obviously it's deserved, but it can be motivational, but you struggle. How do I give this a low grade? I am going to do that. But how do I do it in a way that doesn't destroy the person's, sense of self?
Yeah, exactly. So I think, before we get into the other kind of studies, but, I feel like the takeaway from that initial study that we did with the subset of students who feel like they're going to do well, they don't do well, and they have a high proneness to shame, I believe the applicability of that one study is that we as instructors, professors, or high school teachers, we need to remain neutral when it comes to expectations of success, because I've probably been guilty of this. I don't want to speak for you, but maybe you have. I'm sure many of us have been guilty where we've passed out an assignment and we say to our students, well, this shouldn't take you but a few minutes, or, I need to give you this. It shouldn't be too difficult. Just knock this out real quick and we'll move on to something else. And I feel like what we're doing when we do that is that we are setting up expectations for success. And then when you do that and a particular student doesn't do as well as they thought they were going to do, and they have that proneness to shame, those are going to be the ones that experience shame. And then again, how that is going to impact them moving forward is kind of an open question. But I definitely don't think you're doing them any favors by throwing in little statements like that before you hand out an assignment to complete.
Interesting. Okay, so continue on with your research. So what happens when the student feels shame?
Yes. So our most recent work really is we've done a couple of studies, and we did have, a shame induction group where we kind of did the same thing that we did. We give them a test and give them a false score and basically try to make them feel bad about themselves. And we have other groups in which they're just control groups, right? So they take the same test as those in the shame induction condition, but at the end of the test, we don't give them any feedback at all. We just basically say, thank you for completing this portion of the study. Please let the experimenter know it's time to move on. So we try to remain neutral as far as shame is concerned. So once they were either in the shame induction condition or our control condition, we then try to teach them complex science topics like physics and the human circulatory system. And we want to see what impact that shame has on any subsequent learning that we're trying to make happen. And, I don't want to make any definitive statements here because we're still kind of in the process of collecting data and analyzing data. But I do believe that an important point or a theme that's starting to emerge across these different studies is that, as with everything in psychology, the answer is it depends. So if you say, is shame good for learning? Is shame bad for learning? I would say the answer is it depends. And what I mean by that is it depends on certain individual characteristics within the learner. So what we're finding, which is really counterintuitive and exciting, at least in my eyes, because this goes against much of the research, much of the limited research. So again, that's maybe not saying too much, but it's counterintuitive in that we're finding that academic shame might not be all bad all the time. So there might be a time and a place in which shame can be beneficial for learning.
It's funny because you would think, well, that's shame is terrible. Shame is going to always be bad. You make me think about a time when I did get a C on a paper from one professor and an A from another professor, and I knew that I didn't really put in that much time on either one of these papers. So getting the C made me feel a little bit more helpful, actually, because I just felt like, look, you deserve the C, man.
I think, and I think you'll like this because, well, let me say this. So in one particular, this most recent study that we were doing, we induced shame in some of our participants and others we didn't. And then afterwards we said, okay, your job is, you have 30 minutes to learn all you can about the human circulatory system. And basically, we just turned them loose in Encyclopedia Britannica, this hypermedia environment in which they could watch videos and click links and read text. And basically, we gave them 30 minutes to learn all they could about the human circulatory system. And some of those participants were going into this learning session feeling really bad about who they were, and others were arguably emotionally neutral. And in some of the very preliminary results, this is really hot off the press. This is not old at all. But what we found was that in the people who were in the shame induction condition, those who had a high proneness to shame and were in the shame induction condition, these people still learned, but it wasn't a lot. Their learning gains were comparable to the control condition. They increased about 10% from pre-test to post-test. But when you look at those in the shame induction condition who had a low proneness to shame, on average, they actually are increasing by 35% from pre-test to post-test. So almost an equivalent of 3.5 letter grade increase for those who were in the shame induction condition that had a low proneness to shame. I think what's going on is that these are people who are not accustomed to feeling shame. Mm-hmm. And so when they do feel shame, similar to what productive confusion is doing, I make the argument that if you're not accustomed to feeling shame and all of a sudden you do have this perceived failure and you are feeling bad about yourself, you start asking yourself, what went wrong? Like, what does this say? What was I supposed to do? And again, it jolts them back into what it is they're supposed to be doing. So perhaps they have a heightened sense of cognition going into the learning session, whereas those who experience shame, who have a high proneness to shame, I would argue that shame dampens down any subsequent learning. In other words, shame is taking cognition hostage.
Interesting. And so what you're saying is that if I don't know how I did, so I have no feedback, I learned a little bit more about circulatory system while I'm clicking around. If I am in the shame induction condition, so I found out I didn't do very well, but I'm not really prone to shame. But I did learn that I kind of didn't do very well. That person is going to say, well, crap, I better, I'm going to learn a lot now. So that person's scrolling and watching videos and reading and going to town because in a sense to, I guess, am I right, compensate for that failure.
Yeah, I think that's one excellent explanation of what's going on. Now, again, unfortunately I can't see in this black box that is the mind to know exactly what it is they're thinking. But yeah, I mean, I think that it is activating some sort of underlying cognitive mechanism that is increasing learning, and whether or not it's increasing motivation or they're trying to compensate for their low score, their fake low score on the test that they took prior to trying to learn about the circulatory system. I mean, you got it. I mean, those are the ones that really seem to be learning a lot from pre-test to post-test compared to the same participants who actually have a high proneness to shame. Again, if you've got a high proneness to shame, again, my thinking is you get your test score back and you think, well, here we go again. I'm just not college material. I've got no business being in college. People are going to find out I'm a fraud. But now, thanks a lot. You want me to learn about the circulatory system. All I can think about is what an idiot I am.
Yeah, right. And so as a result of that, you give me the 30 minutes to learn, and I'm like, I guess, whatever, I'll go to Wikipedia, and you don't scroll that far down. You don't go to YouTube. You don't go to Google. You put not much effort into it because you kind of feel, what good is it? It's sort of a learning process.
Exactly, yeah.
Very interesting research. And that's, and as I said, it does hit home because I know that my son felt more than just a sense of frustration at not having gotten the question right. It was more like just, you had to bring his ego back up.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, I mean, and I don't want to take up all of your time, of course, but I will say this. I mean, where I'm wanting to go with this research, and I won't go into all the details in the interest of time, but where my vision for where I want to take this in the next 3 to 5 years is really kind of twofold. Number one, I'm interested in really looking at unique linguistic characteristics of shame compared to other emotions. And what I mean by that is, when someone is describing a shameful experience? Are the words that they're using, are those unique to a shameful experience? And the intonation and the pitch and the speech rate in which they're talking, is there something unique about all of that when someone is describing a shameful experience? Because, if you think about it, a student who, after having failed an exam, maybe they stay after class to talk to the instructor about their performance. And wouldn't it be awesome if we could determine based on speech alone whether or not individuals were experiencing shame? What if a teacher was able to figure out which subset of students were actually experiencing shame and could be proactive to those potential negative consequences? And so I feel like understanding the linguistic components of shame, that we could perhaps facilitate teachers' ability to provide motivational interventions. And so that's one area that I'm interested in. But another area where I want to take this is I'm really interested in developing a shame resiliency intervention that can be easily delivered by administrators and teachers that would increase retention rates and increase student success rates, to maybe, teach them the difference between guilt and shame and say, look, it's okay to feel guilty. If you failed the test because you didn't study enough and you didn't come to class and you didn't take notes, you should feel guilty, but that's okay. But if you failed the test and you think you failed the test because you're stupid, that's not okay, And so if we could develop some sort of program that could help break this maladaptive feedback cycle, I think that would be, that's got far-reaching applications.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and it could have helped me 10 years ago. If you had advice as to how to, what are the best ways to help a student when that student is clearly, feeling like a piece of crap.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Jeremiah, great talking with you, and keep going with this really interesting research.
All right. Well, it was good talking to you.
Okay, great. Take care.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye now.